Hi, HR Nation, it's Chris Rainey. Welcome to HR Leaders, the show where we interview today's most successful and innovative HR practitioners 5 days a week. Today, we have a special guest. We're joined by Jason Treu, executive coach, leadership and management expert. Jason, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic. Thanks for having me on the show and speaking to your fantastic tribe.
Fantastic. I really appreciate you joining us. Jason, give our listeners a little bit about yourself personally, a bit of insight, and also your journey to where we are today.
Sure. So I work with organizations, companies on leadership management and really helping their teams perform at the highest level. And I started out my journey going to law school, getting my master's in communications, and then I decided to go in another route and went out to Silicon Valley for 15 years and got to work with some great people like Steve Jobs, Mark Cuban, the CEO of Netflix, on and on and on. And then at the same point, I was like, I don't really know if I love working in corporate America anymore. And I was just drawn to really working with people and helping them maximize their potential and figuring out processes that business used that really could take everyone to the highest level. So I just started out on that journey.
Mm-hmm. And now being on the other side of the coin, is it a lot different than you thought it'd be? Now you've taken that leap. I certainly know from my perspective how it is taking that leap, going from working in a corporate organization, then going out on your own, starting your own business. How's that experience been for you?
No, it's been great. Obviously, you have to live with a lot more uncertainty. And
Yes.
the uncertainty is definitely challenging at times to have to do all the things that you have to do. And it's a 24/7 job, 7 days a week, without a guidepost that's in a blueprint for you to work off of. So I think all of that takes a lot of getting used to. And you just have to manage the ups and downs through support, belief, determination, and a lot of grit and just hard work.
Yeah, well, I like the way you didn't sugarcoat it for everyone listening. I always say to everyone, it's like all my friends and family, like, how is it? I'm like, well, literally, it's like jumping out of a plane and building your parachute on the way down. That's the best way. I heard someone say that one day, and I was like, that's exactly how it feels, and it never stops.
It doesn't.
So yeah, perfect. Well, look, today, the reason I was excited to have you on the show and that we've connected is obviously to talk about how we can build high performing teams in our organizations. Obviously, a huge focus for all of the leaders that listen to this show. So give us some insights into some of the work that you're doing and let our leaders know how they can do this, because I'm sure they'll be very interested.
Sure. So 3 years ago, I've been working with clients for a while. One of the things 3 years ago I started to ask myself is that why is it that some teams are outperforming others? And especially if you look even in a sales organization, you'll have a top 1% team and then you'll have people at the bottom. And I thought these inconsistencies really didn't sit with me well. And the more reading I did, I found that when people talked about culture or building high performing teams, it was almost like mythology. They'd interview some successful person, like an Entrepreneur magazine or Forbes or Fortune, and they'd back out their success, but there'd be really almost no tools or processes for people to use that they could do easily, quickly, and institute it in their organization, whether it's 2 people or it would be 100,000 people. And I felt like whenever that happens, people aren't doing the work and they're trying to keep it sort of in a mythology stage because then you need them in order to get there. And I was like, if you can't operationalize it, in my head, it's not real, because then it's just flights of fancy. And like we talked about before, you could be successful in a company building a culture and high performing teams one time and move to the next and it be horrific. And I found that just shouldn't be the case. It should be just like a supply chain or manufacturing. You should be able to do certain things and get certain outputs. And if you can't do that, there's a real problem. And I found that when you take a look today, disengagement in the workplace is at the highest point it's ever been. Gallup did a poll, and in the US it's 70%, but globally it's 89%. So that's zombie workers, right? So if you have all of that, you're not having innovation, creativity, problem solving, and your lack of performance is costing, in the US, $550 billion, but, magnifying that globally, and it's an astronomical number.
So what, during this research you did, what are some of the common mistakes that companies are making?
Well, I think part of the mistake is that people are trying to separate work-life balance out of the situation. So what happens is people think, oh, I'm going to go to work and I am just this work person and my personal life doesn't factor into it. Well, what happens is that then people bring problems into work that are never dealt with. They don't have hard conversations with people, and they don't get to know them on a fundamental level. And the problem with that is when you look at building trust, which is the glue that holds people together in business, well, that is rocketed by vulnerability and sharing. And the backbone of all of that is caring. And I found that people do a very poor job of that. And one of the things that I found out of that was Google a couple of years ago did research called Project Aristotle, and they were trying to figure out how to build the highest performing team globally. And they hired researchers from Harvard and other schools to come in and take a look at it over a 2-year period of time. And what they found out was it wasn't individual performance, background, education, it was psychological safety. And without psychological safety, they had no high performing teams. And the difference at Google was the highest performing teams, they contributed 19% more to the bottom line. They were lauded by Google execs. They were much better team players, so everything that they wanted. But it was the psychological safety, which is in essence, getting to know people on a deep personal level, being able to ask questions to clarify situations, and thirdly, being able to take risks, being accountable for them with boundaries, but being able to then look at them objectively and institute them back into the company rather than having it be, if you made a mistake, that was what you were identified with.
Yeah. And you can see that in the actions that Google have taken, right? Because now they're really high on promoting, they want people to innovate and take risks, and they allocate a certain amount of time for each employee to go and explore new projects that they're interested in, etc. And many organizations have now followed that trend. It's certainly come a long way from in my career, where you'd definitely be reprimanded for trying to try something that fails, whereas now companies are telling their employees they want to do it. They're encouraging them to take risk, because that's where the innovation comes from, right? Without doing that, then you're not going to innovate.
No. And I think and the challenge is that most aren't. I mean, you're seeing them in pockets and teams, but when you really go in, and so
Yeah.
I also, have been observing, I've sat in 19 of the top 20 companies at Forbes and Fortune's Workplace in last year and this year to observe teams and watch them and see the things that they're doing differently. And the challenge is the people leading these teams and in these organizations don't really know why. And so they're not really setting up a layer of psychological safety, and they're not realizing that in order for people to care about each other on a deep level, they have to have candid conversations. And one easy way is for people to start self-disclosing about themselves and sharing who they are, because that starts to rocket trust, because you're being much more vulnerable. And I think most people think that you have to trust someone to be vulnerable when it's the exact opposite. Yeah, so I think that causes a lot of challenges, because then what happens is people are just disconnected in the workforce, right? And people don't care. And when people say, well, why does it matter when people care? Well, a couple of years ago, I interviewed all the employees that my managers were reporting into. And the reason they said they stayed up to 1 a.m. in the morning doing emails or in presentations or sweated over the details was they didn't want to let their manager or their manager's manager down. So letting people down in disappointment is a major driver. And why is that? Because they felt like those people cared about them in a deep way. And so when you don't have caring as a fundamental part of your business, people are not invested in it, because they don't treat you like the same way they treat the people in their personal life that they care for the most, that they do anything for. If they're not willing to do anything or everything for you in a business setting, you are not going to get an employee performing at the top 1%, which is what separates out the greatest from great and good and down the line.
We've come a long way though, right? Because I think when I first started in the corporate world, it was the complete opposite advice that I got from my CEOs and managing directors and directors of, Chris, you're a manager. They're not your friends. I remember I used to go to lunch, even go to gym with a lot of my team members. And I actually had meetings with managers saying, you shouldn't have that relationship with your team because you're a manager and they work for you. And and unfortunately, and I'm probably sure you agree, I'm sure many organizations still operate in that old model. Would you agree?
Yeah, they do. And the key thing is what you're talking about is what we've been doing since caveman days. We want to create a sense of belonging. Belonging is in our DNA, and so is connecting. And when we operate outside of that and feel disconnected, then we don't care. We're not engaged. We're not emotional, right? And that's why the results are so bad overall. I mean, you look at all the data, and it's like trust is at the lowest point in the workplace. People are communicating at the lowest levels. Collaboration is horrible. I saw another study the other day that 70% of teams are dysfunctional. I mean, we're talking about massive problems. And the fact is today, people are so disconnected. 40% of the population in the US is lonely, meaning that they don't have people that they can share things with, not that they're around other people. And the equivalency of that is smoking 15 cigarettes a day for a person, which deteriorates your health, your mental cognition, your engagement, and everything else. And so today in the workplace, people are there, they have to find social connection because they don't have it in their personal lives. And so if you get rid of that, then what are they going to do, right? It's not like it was back in the 70s and 80s and before then, where people had all this connectivity outside of work. A lot of that is because of the internet and social media. But regardless, you are where you're at, right? You have to adapt to the current climate and situations. And when you don't, then your business takes a major hit.
It's a lot to take in, but it's very important. And I'm sure the HR leaders listening right now, they're the ones that are closest to this. And they're the ones that are seeing this within their organizations and are obviously in the best position to make an impact in this area, in my opinion, which is why I was excited to have you on the show. So tell us about some of the work that you're doing with companies to help change this in their organizations and engage their employees and move a step closer to solving this problem.
Yeah, so I think one of the things is trying to get people to understand that when you self-disclose and share information about yourself, you get people to not only connect with you on an experiential level, but on an emotional level, and you create a deep connection. And what happens is people drop their biases, prejudices, or thoughts about you, and then they start to just see you as a human being and someone that's just like them. And that creates much tighter bonds for people. And then they're much more invested in each other's success, no matter what it is. So what I started to do was I found some research by Professor Arthur Aaron back in 1997, and he was trying to get people to essentially create best friends by snapping his fingers. And I laughed. I thought, okay, well, how is this possible? But he got 54 research students or grad students in this research study to come in, and he had them ask 36 questions that were very vulnerable over 45 minutes. And the ninth question was something like, tell me 3 things that you like about me. And think about the fact is that that's like 6 minutes into knowing someone because these were all strangers, right? Mm-hmm. Well, what's incredible, at the end of 45 minutes, 30% of the people in the original research study said that that person sitting across from them who was a stranger was the closest person in their life. They felt like that person knew more information than any other person. So it tells you how low the bar is and what's really possible. So when you can get people to start sharing with people, they're going to be much more connected. And so essentially I've taken questions and I put people in groups, and it's something I did at Google when I spoke there, is I get people in small groups, share questions like, tell me about the biggest lesson you've learned in the last year, right? And questions like that. And when you get them inside of a group and everyone's answering it, you're connecting really powerfully. And then not only in the small group, what happens is it spreads to all the other groups, right? No matter how large it is, as long as everyone knows they're doing the exercises. And one of the first times I did this, I was trying this out a couple of years ago, and I went in an organization, and there were 2 women in the organization that were critical for its functioning, and the organization was starting to flounder. and they essentially hated each other. Like they were arch enemies. Think about superheroes and super friends, like Superman and Kryptonite. Like it was that bad. And so I asked a question in the group, which was, tell me about the biggest loss you've had in the last 5 years. And one of the women said, was my mother. The other one said it was their dog. And everyone listening is saying, well, they're not the same things, but they connected on the emotion of loss. And so I saw them walk out of the room and start to talk. And little did I know, later in the week, they went out to lunch, and 30 days later, they became friends. And what happened was the business started to function significantly better, and better than it ever had before, because they put down in a moment their biases and prejudices and saw themselves as two people. And in that moment, they forgot about the stories of why they didn't like each other and found reasons to actually like each other. And then from there, it all changes, right? And it happens all the time.
What I love about your example is, as well, is for everyone listening, this doesn't cost huge amounts of investment, money to make happen. And I'm assuming that you did this with people at all levels. So
Yeah,
it doesn't matter what level. And that's something that excites me as well, is getting the opportunity, maybe as someone who's just joining the organization, to perhaps have a conversation in one of those, that type of environment with different people within the organization as well. So because not only are you breaking that connection, that boundary, but you're also connecting with people in the organization you would never normally speak to.
And you can use it on a team level without the rest of the organization. You could use it one-on-one with people, right? On your own. You could use it with people outside the organization you need to connect with. It really doesn't matter. What happens is when you build higher levels of trust, people want to work with you and make you successful. So it doesn't matter how you utilize this information. And I was reading last year, Harvard Business Review, the Surgeon General in the US, he did something very similar to this, and it said it revolutionized his staff meetings. And what he did, and something that I've been doing before then, was he had everyone in a staff meeting bring a picture, and a picture that was meaningful to them. And they had essentially a minute to say who was in the picture and why it was meaningful to them. And he said it changed the entire running of his entire meeting and their production and performance, because people started to connect and care, right? And in a way that he had never seen before, because they saw each other as human beings and they got to know each other much deeper and closer. And then they cared about each other, and therefore you do a lot different things. You listen more, you communicate better, you collaborate, you resolve conflicts faster, right? So I always tell people when they're doing this, it's almost like you're doing leadership and management training on steroids at the same time. You don't even need to do it until you do something like this, because a lot of the problems solve themselves.
Do you use the same questions for every single session, just out of interest?
I change it around depending on kind of what's happening in there. But you can just use a random set of questions. I give people all the questions, so you could pick out any of them and you would be successful. Now I separated them into questions, one that are, tell me, if you had to pick a superpower, what would you have? And then deeper,
like an icebreaker question. And then,
because some people, they are much more reticent to going into deeper questions. But the reality is that all the time when I'm doing it in a workshop for someone, I just start off with the deeper questions and then people doing it. And I found that they'll just jump right in and execute it. Now, the key is when you're having deeper questions, and if there are different levels in the room, the person who's most senior has to go first, because they have to show that it's safe to share, right?
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I was going to ask that. I think that's very important. It sets a tone and lets everyone else know, okay, this is okay.
Yeah, and one of the other questions that comes up, and I'll get it here and there, is, well, what happens if someone uses that information against you? And I have never seen that so far. I'm sure that it could happen somewhere. Yeah. But I think people, unless they're mentally ill or off on the deep end some way, like there are boundaries people operate within, especially when you're sharing with inside of a group. And it's never been reported back to me in any of the things I've done. And I just think it's be extremely rare. We can all bring up a worst case scenario, but the reality is that, that's never happened before. And so I think that, the issue is that unless you start to tackle tough conversations and have them, you're going to find that you'll never be able to perform at the highest levels, and you'll always have significantly more challenges than the people that do, because that's an essence of a great leader and a great manager, but it also is a great employee, and you have to take the initiative. You can't wait around for other people to create the culture you want. You can do this on your own, even if you're an individual contributor. You can take the questions and start asking your manager, start asking your manager's manager, start talking, using it. You can, use it with people outside the organization. But it's a tool to show you that when you start self-disclosing, you'll get other people to open up. And then you will see really the magic, and you'll be way more productive. And it's really, when you take a look at it, I talk to really successful salespeople, and I share this with them, and they're like, my gosh, you figured out exactly what we do. This is
I was, by the way, this whole time I'm from a sales background, I was thinking about that because it's all open questions. So it'd be, yeah, exactly.
Right. What this game, my Cards Against Mundanity, what it does is it gives you a tool to operate like the top 1% of salespeople, and it shows you what they do. And then what happens is you can take the strategies and tactics and then create ways for you to interact that you want to do. But now you can see in the moment when you're doing it and get the evidence of it, this is what these people are doing. They're just doing it in different ways, but it all goes back to the same thing, right? Self-disclosure and getting people to share things that they would share on the 10th or 20th conversation with someone. You're getting them to do it on the first. And that's how you fast track relationships, fast track business deals, performance, everything else.
So just for context for Jason, give everyone listening, let them know a bit more about the game and where that all came from and how that came to be, the Cards Against Mundanity.
Yeah, so Cards Against Mundanity, you can go to Cards Against Mundanity and download it for free. And I give you FAQ and everything in there as well. And I did it for a TED Talk that I was doing last year. And in essence, one of the challenges is that, whenever you do a TED Talk, it's great, but then you're left, well, what do I do, right? How do I utilize this? And I wanted to create something that was really simple that anyone could use no matter where they were in the world, to really foster better relationships with the people around them. And so it's all you have to do is just start. And I tell people how you start off with a complete stranger is, I've got this fun game that I love to play, and I'm just interested if you like to play a couple rounds. It's a question and answer game, right? Mm-hmm. And here's the thing. We've all learned as little kids that games are fun. So no one says no, ever, right? Now, if you went up to someone and asked the question, because I started off that initially, I found people reticent because what happened is it just seems rather strange. But if they're reading the card on a game, they'll literally tell you anything because they're distracted, because they played games before and they've never had a bad experience where like, oh, this is horrific. They may not have loved it, but it's never been bad. But if you ask someone a question, you've had situations where people have asked you vulnerable questions that haven't gone great, like tough conversations, breaking up with people or something else. So that becomes difficult, right? But the game itself is simple. So I told people, just use that. You don't need to come up with it. I'll do all the work for you. All you have to do is bring it up and then show people a question, and then they'll start to answer, and it's off from there.
So people can use this in their meetings with their teams. How did you come up with all the questions, by the way?
I started to look around at questions that you could use in the workplace and things that would really create discussions for people, that would get them to really think, and questions that probably none of us have ever been asked before by people. And I found that it doesn't even matter. Like I had last year, I gave these questions to people who really knew each other well, because I had people ask, well, what happens if the team had been together for like 10 years? So I gave these to people who had been best friends for 20 years and had lived in the same city, or who had been married happily for 20 plus years. And I had them play it for 60 minutes. And all of them said they learned a substantial amount of information that they never would have learned, and it would have changed their relationship for the positive. And they most likely never would have asked these questions ever, right? So I found that like that's the key. It's that we're not asking deep enough questions to get to know the people around us, and we can fast track all of that, and it can make our lives substantially better, not performance, but also in fulfillment, right? I mean, you want to go to work every day and be more excited about it and fulfilled and be able to get through the tough times. Well, that requires people around you to support you, buy in the things that you're doing, take leaps of faith, innovate, be creative. Well, you can't do that unless you have a certain type of people around you. And I ask people all the time, like, think to yourself, what's the best team you've ever been on personally or professionally? Like, how did that feel? What emotions came up? And when you think about that, that's what keeps CEOs and executives awake at night, because if they could recreate that feeling in that organization, they would immediately increase the bottom line. Well, you can too in anything that you do if you just remember that. And it benefits you to try to create your best team on every team that you're on. And it's not hard. It doesn't take much time at all.
Yeah, I'm sitting here thinking I'm going to do this tomorrow with my team.
If you do it, I guarantee you at the end of it, you're going to see some pretty great conversations and opening up and engagement. And when you watch people in the room, what's really interesting is you'll see people start off and they'll be, at some noise level, but then they'll start going higher and higher and higher. And then you'll see their body language starts to tip in as well. And it happens every single time.
Is it 1v1 in a group dynamic? Are you asking that one question to everyone, or are you breaking people up?
Yeah. So what I do now is I have tell me about, one of your greatest accomplishments or something that you've had in the last year or something like that. And then everyone answers the question in the group. And then
do you know you're going to answer that? So for example, or do I just choose them at random?
You can do whatever you want. You can pick it out. You can have ones chosen beforehand. It really just depends on what you want to do and how you want to handle it. I think that either way, if the other people in the group don't know what the question is, then it's random anyway. So
you're going to get a more authentic answer, I think, that way. Otherwise, I would prefer myself not to know as well, as in like just to choose a question out of, and not know, because that means that I'm on the same playing field as the team.
There's plenty of them in there. There's like 50 of each type of questions of kind of more icebreakers and then things.
Have you categorized the questions?
I categorize them in terms of questions that are more icebreaker-ish type questions. And right? I call them conversation starters and connection questions.
Great.
Because, different people want to start at a different place. And I want people to start where they're comfortable in. But the reality is that the result sets are the same. People end up in the same place no matter what.
And as you said, regardless of the size of your team, whether it's 1v1 or, for a 10,000 plus organization, this is something you can all implement straight away as well. So very excited about sharing that. What's the feedback been so far, Jason, before we jump into the quick fire round? What's the feedback you're getting from people?
Been great, right? I've done it in, Google, at Amazon, at Microsoft, at Blue Cross here. I mean, in a bunch of different Southwest Airlines. I did it last week. So I've done it in a lot of organizations and people love it and they see dramatic results. I do a pre and post survey in my workshop and I'm seeing on average a 20% increase in trust, engagement, and team closeness in the time that it starts and ends, which is like an hour and a half.
Just within that 1 hour and a half.
Yeah. And that would take an average person probably several years and six figures.
Because when do you ask those questions and, when's that naturally going to come up and occur? It's not really, is it?
No. I mean, and we don't ask it, right? So like another quick thing you could do if you have a user conference or customer conference is I've had people go up and share like a minute or 2 minutes of the customers that are there, tell me the biggest lesson you've learned in the last year. And it doesn't even have to be about the product or solution. It could just be what they've learned in business. And it's amazing what happens inside of that customer or user conference when that occurs and the conversations that get started and the stickiness and who comes back the next year and what all happen and how much they can upsell at the actual event. Right?
Interesting.
Right? It gets people immediately leading it off by getting the people in the audience not to be a zombie, but they have to be engaged. And you can give them a minute or 2 minutes to share something. It doesn't have to be super in depth.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to try that our next workshop, by the way. I wrote it down. I'm going to do it. I do normally do something similar, but I think that's a great idea and something more current as well. Like the question you use as a great example to get people talking. So if companies want to get in contact with you personally to come and facilitate this and not do it themselves, what's the best way for them to reach out to you, Jason?
They can go to my website. It's jasontreu.com. It's jasontreu.com. jasontreu.com.
Fantastic. And we're just going to jump into the quick fire round before we wrap up. So I'm going to ask you 5 questions and you have no longer than 30 seconds to give us some amazing answers. Are you ready?
Sure.
What was the number one thing that was holding you back in your career from progressing?
I think belief in myself.
Yeah. Everyone can relate to that. What's the best piece of business advice you've ever received?
Have tough conversations with people.
What's one book that you recommend to our audience and why? We'll definitely include yours, don't worry, but any other books?
I would do anything by Brene Brown. She's got a new book, Daring to Lead, and I love her books. I think she's the only author I give every one of my clients books from, because I think they are the best business and leadership books.
Fantastic. Could you share one internet resource that you use to increase your own productivity and stay connected?
LinkedIn.
Yeah. And I just copy and paste that in there from now on. Everyone keeps saying LinkedIn. What's one thing about your business that you're most excited about today?
I think it's this game and getting people really engaged and caring about each other, and then showing them that being vulnerable and truth telling with people will get them significantly farther.
Mm-hmm. I honestly, I do love the fact that you've taken that and made it a game, because it just introduces it in a fresh, non-intrusive way that allows people just to open up and relax, as opposed to here's a set of questions, ask someone that, because then that then creates a bit of anxiety around it. And so I love the fact you've done that, and I'm not surprised that it's taken off and you're getting the feedback. So thank you so much for coming on the show to share your journey, your experience and insights to us. So before we wrap up, if there's one parting piece of guidance, let us know what that would be. And then of course I'll make sure for everyone that I link up all of the links to your website and the game, etc., in the description for everyone.
Yeah, I think the key is start being more vulnerable, because no one wants to lead with it, but everyone wants everyone else to do it. And when you start being vulnerable, it tells people it's safe to share with you, and that's the key, because vulnerability is the rocket fuel for trust.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, guys, as I mentioned, head over to hrleaders.com. There you'll find all of the show notes from the episode. Everything that we've been talking about with Jason will be there for you, all the links and resources. Apart from that, thank you again, Jason, for taking the time out to join us. And I wish you all the best until we next speak.
Thanks.